Thank you everyone for being here today. We are meeting for another event in this Meet the Author series. Today, we are going to be discussing the article, The Stickiness of Non-Religion, Intergenerational Transmission, and the Formation of Non-Religious Identities in Childhood by Strhan and Rachael Shillitoe. The authors are going to present the article, and then we are going to have a segment of Q&A where we can ask questions and make comments. So I encourage you to do so. Anna Strhan is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of York. She is the author of The Figure of the Child in Contemporary Evangelicalism, Oxford University Press, 2019, Aliens and Strangers, The Struggle for Coherence in the Everyday Lives of Evangelicals, Oxford University Press, 2015, which was shortlisted for the BBC BSA Thinking Aloud Award, 2016, and Levinas Subjectivity Education, Wiley-Blackwell, 2012. She's also the co-editor of Where is the Good in the World? Ethical Life Between Social Theory and Philosophy, Berghahn, 2022. Religion and the Global City, Bloomsbury, 2017, and the Bloomsbury Reader in Religion and Childhood, Bloomsbury, 2017. She is currently leading a 3-year Leverhulme trust-funded project, Becoming Citizens of the Post-Secular Britain, Religion in Primary School Life, with Peter Hemming from Surrey, Sarah Neal from Sheffield, and Joanna Malone from York. Rachael Shillitoe is a sociologist and currently a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Birmingham, working on a project exploring everyday morality in childhood. Her research is primarily in the sociology of religion and childhood studies. She is completing a monograph examining children's experiences of collective worship in schools, negotiation religion and non-religion in childhood, experiences of worship in schools, under contract with Palgrave Macmillan in the Childhood on Youth series, and co-author a book with Anne Strhan called Growing Up Godless, under contract with Princeton University Press. So thank you, Rachael and Anna, for being here. And now I leave you the room.
Thanks very much. And it's great to be able to join you for this great looking seminar series. So I'm just going to share some slides. We're going to give an overview of the Stickiness article. And just to note, so this emerged from a research project that was funded by the Understanding Unbelief research programme, examining how and why children grow up non-religious in the UK. And this feeds into a book that we're currently writing. So it's great to have the opportunity to be able to talk about this. And we look forward to your comments and discussion. And so as well as kind of summarising the article, we'll also say something brief at the end about the current work we're doing based on this research. So I'm just going to move screens around slightly. There we go. So just to provide some context for the article, the rise of those identifying as non-religious in many formerly Christian liberal democracies has been rapid. In Britain, no religion has replaced Christianity as the cultural default, especially amongst younger age groups, while only around half the overall population now express some sort of belief in some kind of God. Alongside this growth of the non-religious, Britain is also becoming increasingly religiously diverse, with the fastest growing forms of religion associated with minority groups. Against the backdrop of this shifting religious landscape, understanding the beliefs, concerns, and experiences of non-religious children as they grow up is a critical task. The growth of the nones has prompted a fast-growing literature on non-religion, atheism, and other forms of non-belief. Yet, although we know that growing numbers are growing up non-religious, we know little about how this change is taking place in everyday life or its significance for children and their families. In recent years, a number of studies have begun to explore the question of non-religious transmission. Linda Woodhead, for example, notes, drawing on data from the British Social Attitudes Survey, that there is a 45% chance that those raised as Christian will end up identifying as non-religious. But for those raised as non-religious, the chance that they will remain non-religious is 95%. Thus, she argues no religion is currently sticky in a way that Christianity is not. Not only are no religion parents more likely to produce no religion children, those children will do the same. so the pool of the non-religious goes on growing. Bernd Bengtson and his colleagues have likewise emphasised the importance of intergenerational relationships and argue that a key vehicle for the growth of non-religion in the USA is the increase in the number of parents and grandparents explicitly socialising their children to a non-religious worldview. Yet while these studies indicate that non-religious transmission across generations is taking place, there's been little research attention to the micro-level processes across different spaces through which socialisation into a non-religious identity is happening, or about how family influence relates to the influence of schooling, peers, and other social networks, media, and culture in shaping children's non-religious identities. Our Stickiness article therefore addresses the variety and forms of non-religious transmission in relation to children of primary school age in England. If no religion is stickier than Christianity in terms of its successful transmission, how should we account for this? Are children being actively socialised by family members as non-religious, as studies focused on the USA have suggested? Or can this be understood primarily as an absence of religious transmission, or a combination of both? In using the term transmission here, we follow other researchers attentive to the agency of children in seeing transmission as involving a dynamic process of inter- and intragenerational negotiation of belief and morality. Our multi-sited qualitative approach enables us to reveal the interplay of processes of socialisation within both home and school in shaping how children in England grow up non-religious, as well as opening up the significance of children's sense of their own agency and choice.
Overall, our wider project explores how, when, where, and with whom children learn to be non-religious and non-believing, aiming to deepen an understanding of how children negotiate, construct, and reconstruct non-belief, and the ways this is shaped by the actions of adults in relation to them. We carried out a multi-sited ethnography with fieldwork conducted in 3 primary schools located in contrasting geographical microclimates of religion and non-religion in England. During the fieldwork, I spent between 6 and 7 weeks in each school. The first school, St. Peter's, is a Church of England primary academy located in an inner city area of the southwest of England, which we chose as a field site because of its high proportion of religious nuns and its diverse religious and non-religious population. The school itself is highly diverse in terms of social class, ethnicity, and religion, with approximately a third of the pupils identifying as Muslim. During the period of fieldwork, the children took part in daily acts of collective worship, and religious education was taught on a weekly basis. The school had close links with the local church, with the school making trips to the church for Christian festivals. There were also various religious and spiritual displays around the school, and what you can see here on your screen is a reflection area, and each classroom in the school had one of these reflection areas. Our second field site, Waterside Primary Academy, is located in a largely middle-class suburban setting of the north of England, chosen in order to enable insight into suburban cultures of non-belief. Religious education was taught less frequently here than at St. Peter's during the period of fieldwork, and the school didn't really have visits to the local church. However, the local vicar did occasionally visit the school to lead assemblies, and for example, at Easter, and a local evangelical youth group also came to lead assemblies, and this in particular actually caused a bit of tension with some non-religious parents. And our third and final field site, Sunnybank Community Primary School, is in a predominantly rural location of the northwest of England, which we chose in order to deepen understanding of predominantly working class non-religious children in a setting in which there is a low proportion of religious nuns. The broader area is starkly divided in terms of race, ethnicity, and religion. And although the school does not have a religious character, the school did hold daily assemblies, which usually included prayers addressed to God, and RE was taught on a weekly basis. Around the school itself, there were several displays about Christianity and British values during the period of fieldwork, with England flags, for example, as you can see here on your screen, used as bunting as decoration around the school corridors. Now, in terms of the methodology, we use participant observation to allow children's voices to be heard in their own social contexts and to understand children's daily routines, rhythms, and embodied practices in everyday school life. During the fieldwork, we adopted a relational approach, focusing on how children learn to be non-religious in both relation to their peers and adults, and in relation to their movement across the spaces of both home and school. Participant observation was conducted with key stage 2 children, so this is children aged between 7 and 11, and we observed daily school, everyday school life with a particular focus on RE and PSHE, which is personal, social, health and economic education, as well as collective worship and assemblies and other contemplative practices. I also conducted paired interviews with between 30 and 40 children from each school, and I conducted interviewed with parents of 15 of these children from each school, and then a further 4 teachers from each school as well. And in terms of sampling, we sampled children using a worksheet activity where we asked children about their belief or unbelief in God. Now, prior to this worksheet, I'd spent 2 weeks in each school informing children about the study and answering any ongoing questions or queries they had about the project. I then gave a child-friendly presentation about the research to each class and really explained that there was no particular definition or religious understanding of God being used, and that there was no right or wrong answers. The worksheets were then distributed, and the children who gave the answer no or not sure to the question, do you believe in God, were then invited to participate in the study. Our interviews with the children were loosely structured to focus what they saw as significant and important in their life. It was their beliefs and their values, as well as their experience of religion within and beyond the school. Now, during the interviews, we also used paper and craft materials, and we made these available to the children who maybe wished to draw images as opposed to answering questions verbally or in addition to this. And in order to gain insight into the material and spatial dimensions of non-religion, 15 of the children sampled in each school were also invited to participate in a photography activity in which they were asked to take photographs of things representing what they thought as meaningful or important in their everyday lives, both in and beyond the school.
So thinking then about the varieties of non-religious transmission, throughout the different points of data collection, the lack of religious socialization or reference to religion in family life was a theme that emerged consistently. During the interviews, the children and their parents were asked about how often religion came up as a topic of discussion at home with friends or at school. And both the children and their parents mostly answered that religion was rarely mentioned in family life or with friends. Other than during school assemblies or RE lessons, religion was not often discussed or mentioned in the majority of children's everyday lives. Children were asked how they felt their parents would identify in terms of religion, and some children didn't know whether their parents were religious and deferred to grandparents' religiosity or life cycle rituals such as baptism as potential markers for religious identity. Edith and Amy, 2 Year 4 girls from St. Peter's, for example, noted that religion never came up in discussion at home and that the question of religious or non-religious identity had never been mentioned. The girls didn't think their parents were religious, noting the lack of religious practice in their lives and adding that if their parents were religious, you'd know about it. Edith said, "My mum, I don't really know about her because I think she's the same as me. She doesn't really know." Amy, "If you don't know about it, I don't think you'd be really religious." Rachel, "What makes you say that?" Amy, "Because then you'd be going to church every Sunday, wouldn't you, if he was really religious? You know what I mean? If he was really religious, I think you'd probably know." Edith, "Yes, because he'd probably be like praying to God every night." And the parents were also often unaware of their children's religious or non-religious identities and beliefs. For example, when Cassandra and Liam, parents from Sunnybank, were asked about this, Cassandra said, "As far as we're aware, they don't believe in it. We've never really..." Liam, "No, I don't really talk about it much." Rachel, "I was going to say, does it come up in conversation much?" Cassandra, "No, it just doesn't. That's probably why they don't believe in it." So this lack of discussion about religion and its absence in family life was one key factor in children's socialization as non-religious, we'd argue, and is an instance of what Phil Zuckerman terms bald secularity, with religion a very marginal element of everyday home life. However, whilst this bald secularity was evident in children's home lives, religion was afforded more prominence in the space of school, with religious education and collective worship, meaning that children do discuss and engage with religion on a regular basis at school in England.
Both religious education and collective worship have been compulsory parts of education in state-funded schools in England since the 1944 Education Act. The religious education clauses of educational law have caused decades of confusion and controversy, with many questioning whether religion, and if so, how religion should be taught in schools. And in these discussions, there's often concerns expressed that religious education is a form of subtle religious indoctrination, or it implies a normative tilt towards taking on a religious identity. However, in contrast, in our research, we found the opposite taking place. The ways in which religion and non-religion were presented in religious education actually provided children with the opportunity to consider their non-religious beliefs and identities in a way that wasn't actually happening in the home or within their friendship circles. And here, for example, on your screen, at Waterside Academy, during a Year 3 RE lesson, the children were asked to think of as many festivals and ceremonies as they could and write them down on post-it sticky notes. The class teacher then asked them to stick these sticky notes on a large piece of flip chart paper, which she had divided religious and non-religious. And so they had to stick the sticky note under one of those headings. And it led the class to discuss whether they thought a particular holiday or festival should be categorised as religious or whether it should be categorised as non-religious. And as you can imagine, there was a real animated debate about Christmas, for example, with many children commenting that although they were not religious, they still celebrated Christmas. And although this activity wasn't aimed at encouraging the children to take a position as being non-religious or religious, the activity nevertheless reproduced a binary relationship between religion and non-religion and prompted the children to consider where they stood in relation to this. Thus, while absent in the home, religion wasn't absent in the school. And this leads to the unremarked nature of children's non-religious identities becoming marked, becoming explicit, and becoming pronounced in daily school life. The significance of religious education in shaping children's self-understanding as non-religious also came up in interviews with children too. For example, Ryan, a Year 5 pupil at Sunnybank Primary School, spoke about how he had begun to identify as humanist after learning about humanism in his religious education lessons. Ryan says, I thought before we learned about humanists, there was no such thing as humanists, and that if you didn't believe in God, and I said, where did you learn about humanism then? And Ryan said, it was in Year 4, I think. And I continued, so were you saying before you learned about humanism, you didn't know it was there? And Ryan said, I didn't think there was such thing as like humanists. When you didn't believe in God or anything, you just had no religion whatsoever. So until we actually did learn about humanists, I didn't know. And I replied, so do you prefer then sort of being able to say what you are rather than what you're not? And Ryan said, yes, I prefer to say things like what I am. I prefer rather than saying what I'm not. Yes, I'm happy about being a humanist, but I didn't really know about humanists until we learned about it. I was a bit, wobbly before we thought about humanists because I didn't really believe in God in the first place, but it's a bit hard to say and stuff. In terms of these different aspects of transmission, it was not, however, simply the relative absence of religion in the home combined with these discussions at school that contributed to the transmission of non-religious identities. There were also some instances of more implicit and banal expressions of non-religious socialization in some of the families. Harriet, for example, who's the mother of Elliot, a boy from Sunnybank, when asked how she had identified in relation to religion in the previous census, that's the large-scale survey we have, and how she would identify now, she replied, if I was being really serious and taking the survey seriously, I'd put no religion. If it was the census, I'd put Jedi. From that thing that started in the early 2000s about if enough people said Jedi, they'd classify it as religion. So every census, I always put down Jedi. But for proper work stuff, I'd put down no religion. And when I asked whether she intentionally incorporated any religious, spiritual or secular worldviews into her son's upbringing, Harriet responded that she wasn't aware of doing so and she couldn't think of any occasion where she had actually intentionally done that. And at the end of the interview, as I was packing up and ready to leave, Harriet asked if I'd like to see her toilet, as this might be of interest for the study. And And when I went to go and take a look at her downstairs toilet, it was covered in framed pictures and paintings of religious imagery and figures from Roman Catholicism and Mormonism. When I asked why she decorated a toilet like this, Harriet laughed and she said she wasn't really sure why, but she had mentioned earlier that she was interested in these religious traditions because of her grandparents and her ex-husband's religiosity. When I had asked why she chose the toilet of all the places to hang these pictures, Harriet laughed again and she said, well, I like to make my boyfriend uncomfortable when he goes to the toilet. This, we could argue, perhaps represents a banal form of non-religious socialization. It's what Michael Billig calls, in relation to nationalism, the unwaved flag, as an unremarked upon material form of unbelief. Now, Harriet's initial uncertainty over the meaning of her decoration of the toilets reflects this banality. It's the images that are hung in the toilet as interior decoration, and she was not intentionally conscious of their part in the implicit socialization of religion as something to be made fun of in her children's lives.
So school and family life played an important role in children's formation as non-religious, but what of children's own role? Molly and Rosie, 2 Year 4 girls from St. Peter's, discussed their religious or non-religious identities in relation to their parents and how this might change over time. Molly spoke about how, although her dad was Muslim, this didn't mean she had to identify as Muslim. She said, if I was in reception, that's the first year at primary school, and you were talking about this, I would have definitely said, I'm Muslim because my dad is. Rachel, sure, but as you got older, Molly went on, I've realised that I've realised that religion is something that you choose to be. You don't inherit it. I mean, you could inherit it, but you choose to inherit it. You choose to be what you are. Rosie, her friend, replied, when I was younger, I thought I had to be a Christian because I went to a Christian school, but now I know I don't really have to be anything. I can just believe what I like and I can choose. I don't have to follow what school I go to, what people believe in. I don't have to do that just to fit in. I can choose whatever I like. I used to think that I had to be a Christian to fit in as well, otherwise everyone would not like me. But then I realized Molly likes me and she knows I'm not a religion. Molly said, I thought the same thing too. And Rosie replied, I have a lot of friends, even though I'm not a religion. And then I realized I could just believe whatever I liked. So for Molly and Rosie, choice and the ability to make your own decisions regarding your beliefs and identity were of central importance to them. Although both girls recognised the relationality of beliefs and religious identity, they didn't see these as dictating how they identified and perceived personal autonomy as also crucial. And this was a theme that emerged consistently across all the children we spoke to. So these children's reflections illustrate that when considering the formation of non-religious identities, children's sense of their own agency in this process is also a significant dimension of their recognition of themselves as non-religious or non-believing. So to conclude, understanding the rise of non-religion requires attending to how this change is taking place, and children's formation as non-religious is an important part, we would suggest, of this process. Danielle Ervue-Leger's theory of religion as a chain of memory argues that in modernity, this chain is being broken through a lack of religious transmission. Our findings build on this and open up a more nuanced picture, demonstrating that not only is a lack of religious transmission occurring, but that this takes place alongside and in relation to banal implicit forms of non-religious socialization in the home, together with more explicit forms of socialization occurring in schools, through which children come to articulate their non-religious beliefs and identities. And as I mentioned earlier, this article feeds into the book that we're currently working on, entitled Growing Up Godless, Non-Religious Childhood in Contemporary England, which explores how these children are growing up and what it means to them and their parents to be non-religious and non-believing, challenging, for example, popular stereotypes of the non-religious as lacking a moral compass, and revealing how these children's non-religion is interwoven with an ethic of equality and care for the other. As well as these questions of socialization examined in the Stickiness article, our book also explores the lived experiences of non-religious childhoods, with chapters focused on these children's beliefs, on non-religious parenting practices, on how non-religion is shaped and performed within everyday school contexts, on the embodied material and emotional dimensions of children's non-belief, and on the ethics and values interwoven in these children's non-religion and how this is subtly shifting across generations. So I will draw that to a close there. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Thank you both. So now we're going to start a Q&A segment. You can raise your hand or you can indicate you have a question in the chat, and I am going to moderate this exchange. So I don't know if anybody has a question or a comment and wants to make. You go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel and Anna. It's nice to see you again. Fascinating presentation and paper. I actually reread the paper this morning just to make sure I knew what we were going to be talking about. I have multiple questions. I'm going to start with one, and hopefully other people will jump in. As I read through your paper again this morning, I've got a book coming out, and I'll talk more about that and some of the other questions, that's very much about secularization. And so as I was reading through your paper, I was kind of surprised that there's like no discussion of secularization until the very end. And it might even be in the conclusion. There's like one sentence that mentions secularization. And I'm intrigued by this, right? I'm genuinely intrigued by why there's not a lot of talk about secularization. So the sentence basically says, in a wider landscape of religious change in Britain, a country in which Christianity remains deeply culturally embedded, but which is also becoming both more non-religious, more diverse, moving beyond secularization theories in which non-religion and the secular are presented as the mere absence of religion is an important task. And I'm wondering if you can unpack that for me. I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean by moving beyond secularization theories. In particular, the last part I think is interesting. So that's the first part of my question. And then the second part of the question is, why is your paper not using a secularization framework? And you could have any number of reasons, right? It's not like it's a bad thing. I'm just genuinely intrigued at the absence of any discussion of secularization in that paper. I find that fascinating. So I'm wondering if you can answer that.
Rachel, do you want me to say something? Thanks very much for the question. I think the reason why probably we didn't engage that much with secularization theory in this particular article is because of the way that the project originally emerged. It was sort of funded by the Understanding Unbelief Research Programme, where the aim of that programme, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with it, but it was a fund led by Lois Lee at the University of Kent. And the aim was to kind of produce new data about non-belief, looking particularly at, I suppose it was looking at particularly, they had an aim to kind of look at groups of non-believing people who hadn't been explored that much before, kind of looking beyond weird contexts. And so kind of children were of interest to them as a kind of group that hadn't been studied before. I think that was one reason why a project got funded. And so kind of it wasn't sort of the aim of that program wasn't to kind of contribute to kind of new theory development. It was to kind of add data, basically. So I think in terms of when we came to analysing the data in the parameters of that project, one of our questions was like, how are these children becoming non-religious? So that was why we kind of framed it in relation to discussions about transmission and socialization, and how those questions had been treated in existing research literature, and didn't kind of then add in kind of debates about secularization as well. We kept it very much focused on those questions in that article. I think you might be right that maybe my kind of the point that we made about kind of secularization is sort of unnecessarily sweeping in that kind of statement. And I'd kind of add that we've got kind of further funding with Lois Lee actually to do some more analysis on this data, examining kind of causal questions like, why are these children becoming atheists, looking specifically at questions of non-belief and atheism, actually, rather more than non-religion. And in that project, we will definitely be engaging with kind of theories about secularization and sort of ideas about atheization as well. So why do individuals and societies become non-believing? So I will look forward to reading your book as we kind of go back to the data with those kinds of broader causal questions in mind. And there'll be definitely themes that kind of we turn to in the book as well, I imagine. Thank you, though. But yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Well, thank you. That was a great explanation. I really appreciate
it. You can go ahead, Eric.
I just have a general question about technology and the rise of technology and social networks. If that plays a correlation factor with the promotion or the loss of religious principles.
Thank you, Eric. Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could speak to whether there's necessarily a correlation between the rise of, I guess, both technology and children's engagement and lived experiences within the digital world. But what I can say is that children's digital lives and how and the significance of technology is certainly important to them. And so children, when I start the interview and they would speak about, I'd ask them what's important to you. I would say the majority of the times, YouTube or a particular YouTuber would often come up as important. We also asked questions in the interview about people who were important or inspirational to them, and often it was family that would come up, but second to that would be key people who they'd probably seen on television or film or digital media. So I would say the importance of digital technology in particular was very important to the children. But in terms of how that might correlate to their non-religious identity, I couldn't necessarily really speak to. But myself and Anna are both working on new projects now, and in particular the one that I'm working on at the minute, I want to sort of look at that area more, and I think it would be quite fruitful to see how religion and non-religion, play a part in sort of technology and children's experiences of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the answers. You can go ahead, Peter.
Thanks for that presentation. It was very interesting, and the article, of course, was as well. I'm currently involved in at the tail end of a rather large project on religious and non-religious transmission across generations, which is sort of connected to what you're doing, except that you're taking a snapshot in a particular generation, which is the most recent one, and focusing specifically on non-religious children and trying to learn something about their socialization. That's also something that we're doing in the project I'm involved in, among other things. One of the standard kind of distinctions that arises in the literature on this kind of stuff is that it makes a difference that if you're non-religious, say if you're a non-religious child, but you have religious parents, or at least somewhat religious parents, and that somewhat category is the one that I kind of want to zero in on. And if you come from a family where the parents are already non-religious, and they basically, as your research shows, they don't pass on anything as far as religion is concerned. They pass on values and all sorts of stuff like that, but they don't have to do anything to make that happen, because they're living in a social context where this is basically, as you discussed in kind of the banal non-religiosity that's out there, and that's certainly confirmed in our research. The non-religious parents basically have to make little to no effort to pass on their non-religion. Whereas the religious parents, it's exactly the opposite story. They have to go through what enormous lengths to be able to have at least a chance of having religious children. So I'm wondering whether when you research this difference between when the children's parents were themselves expressly non-religious and when the children's parents still had some of that stuff left, and maybe didn't make much effort to pass it on, or maybe made a half-hearted effort, or maybe sent their children to religious schools, to religiously identified schools, in order to say, well, let the school take care of it, that kind of thing. So I'm wondering about that dimension of not the 2 generations of non-religious, but where there's still that transition, which is obviously a big part of the literature on this question.
Thanks very much, Nat. I'm really looking forward to kind of hearing more about the project that you're involved with as well. I think I've seen one conference presentation to do with it, but it'd be great to kind of connect more with the project team and find out more about that. In terms of that kind of the difference, I would say that the majority of ours is a sample of 45 children, 30 to 40 children in each of the schools and their parents. So it's obviously a much smaller sample, and the majority of the parents that we worked with identified as non-religious and non-believing, but we definitely do have parents in our sample who do identify as Christian. Largely would be the kind of largest kind of religious grouping within our sample. But for those parents, a lot of them are identifying as Christian, but not necessarily religiously, say, attending church or kind of having any form of sort of clear religious practices in the home other than Easter and Christmas. And I would say that in terms of the kind of choice to send the children to religious schools, we did say one of the schools is a faith school that we worked with. And in that context, we asked the parents all about their kind of reasons for choosing to send the children to the schools that we did. None of them kind of talked about the kind of faith-based criteria as a positive thing at all, actually. For a lot of the parents, it was a negative thing that it was a church school. And they all talked about sort of wanting to send the children to school as a kind of, because it was they saw it as a good school, or it was close to where they lived. But there is kind of, so in terms of the kind of residual sort of Christianity that some of the children experience, often even with parents who are kind of identifying as Christian, they're not necessarily getting that in the home, but they did encounter that in the Church of England school, St. Peter's, for example. But some of the teachers, when we interviewed them, kind of spoke about how they didn't think that the children necessarily understood, say, the Anglican content that they were kind of getting, because it wasn't kind of made clear to them. And when we asked the children about their understandings of sort of prayers that were said, for example, like particular sort of Christian prayers that were kind of said at the very beginning and end of assemblies, the children didn't necessarily understand the meanings of those. So they might be encountering sort of residual Christian content, but not actually necessarily understanding. So it's not terribly meaningful for them in that kind of context. I don't know if, Rachel, do you have anything that you want to add on that question?
Just one small thing, that was just, as you said, Peter, for the children, it was very much seen as non-religion was kind of like the normative position. That was seen as the norm. So there wasn't that. I think for a lot of the children, like we said in the article, their experience of being non-religious and how they identified wasn't something that was really even talked about or reflected upon within friendship circles or the home. So it was only really sort of RE lessons where that ever sort of was discussed. But yeah, it was just that certainly being non-religious was seen as normative and the norm.
Thanks.
Hi, Charlotte, you can go ahead.
Thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. I've read this article quite a few times because it's quite closely related to my PhD, which is looking at information on school websites and mapping out how schools are English state schools are engaging with religion. I was just wondering why you decided to focus on primary schools, and if you had any plans to kind of extend the research to looking at older pupils, or whether you think findings might be different as children get older.
I think the original decision to kind of focus on primary school children was partly because Rachel and I had both worked in previous projects on primary school age with primary school age children, different projects. Rachel's PhD was on collective worship in primary schools. I'd done a project on evangelical childhoods of around this kind of age. So it kind of partly emerged from that sort of awareness that there kind of wasn't work on non-religious primary school age children. But I definitely would say we're both working on other different projects that don't engage with non-religious secondary school students. And I think it's definitely an area that would be kind of ripe for further study if you're thinking of taking that on, maybe.
Yeah, it was just to add as well that when I think both our interests within this particular age groups is because it is just that bit more marginalised. I mean, childhood and youth studies as a whole, in comparison to empirical studies on adult populations, is marginalised, but even more so when you go for the under 16s and certainly the under 10s. And I think what we often find is that often childhood and adolescence can be combined, and childhood itself can be treated as a monolith, as this purely kind of like one sort of static experience of our lives, or actually that this huge diversity within childhood. So when we're thinking about the nature, the variety, the experience of both being religious and non-religious, there is huge variation, there is huge flux within just the period of childhood itself. And the children in this study, although they're only sometimes as young as 6, they would even speak to their earlier experiences of childhood and how their own non-religious identity has changed since then. So if a 6 or 7-year-old can personally reflect on the changing nature of their own non-religious identity, being only 6 or 7, it just speaks to how much we can miss, perhaps just sort of just quickly skipping beyond this age group as a point of data collection. So I think it's just like sort of that, but equal, I mean, we would absolutely, I would love to do more research that looked really beyond that, and we often speak to sort of studies on adolescence, as a way to kind of like tie our research to the older age groups as well. But it'd be really important to try and kind of go, I think, from as young as possible to up through to adolescence and young adulthood.
Eric, you can go ahead.
I just have a secondary message or secondary question about the reason that society maybe moves too fast, or it's more fast-paced now and then in the past. Does that play a factor with the loss of religious practices or religious values?
I don't know if our data directly speaks to or addresses that question. Other people here might have thoughts on that. But one thing I would say that did come up with a lot of the children when they talked about kind of why they were non-religious or what that meant to them. So we sampled the children according to their non-belief in God, but most of them are non-religious as well as non-believing. Often when they talked about being non-religious, they said that, they had better things to do on a Sunday, because obviously they're kind of saying Christianity is the default. So they have quite a sense of like lots of their own interests that they kind of want to be doing with friends and family. And, religion, religious practice, there's just not time for that. And it's not a priority for them. So I don't think that comes up especially strongly through what the children are saying, because obviously, they're used to the context that they're used to. I mean, sometimes the parents talk about change, but when the parents talk about kind of change in their experiences in relation to their children's experiences, they relate that to the media, but also to kind of growing religious ethnic diversity in society that their children are growing up with compared with their own experiences.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Peter, you can go ahead.
I was very interested in that slide you had where you had the board with the religious and non-religious and the stickies on it. And since you did say, I think you said at the beginning that you were also in the positive content of the non-religion of these children. So I'm interested in whether you, in that particular aspect of your search, found some interesting patterns. So, perhaps in just speaking to what was on those sticky notes, right? They just look like, from my perspective, look like little yellow sticky notes on the one side and the other. But what kind of things did the kids put on the non-religious side, and what kinds on the religious side? Just question of content.
Yeah, I should get that photo up and check, but it was like birthdays. There's something like, I think things like Mother's Day. I think Christmas they put on both. New Year's Day. Yeah, certainly like explicitly sort of, holidays and festivals that weren't related to any religious tradition. I think there was one called Flower Day, which I'd never heard of before. Yeah, I don't know if I could get that picture up, and I don't know if you can zoom in on there and check.
I mean, just to kind of add to that, though, as well as kind of that particular slide, I mean, our broader, to the book we're writing, we're kind of trying to kind of unpick that question of, what is the kind of positive content of the sort of being non-religious for these children and for their parents as well. So there are definitely although kind of often when the children talk about what it means to be non-religious, they might articulate that in terms of, well, they're not involved in religious practices and stuff. But when you kind of start to untangle that, then they'll talk about the kind of reasons for their non-religion, for example, in relation to the ideas of Christianity and as being kind of patriarchal or outdated, as images of kind of God as male, for example. And they generally articulate a very strong commitment to sort of ethics of respect and equality. And their parents especially also often talk about their ideas of religion as at odds with kind of values of equality, respect, ideas of tolerance come up from the parents, less so from the children, who I think kind of don't use the language of kind of tolerance and accommodation so much, but kind of sort of accept a sort of ethic of respecting diversity. So there definitely is a kind of positive content which we're kind of seeking to kind of explore in the book, beyond the kind of specific discussion of kind of things like kind of non-religious festivals, what they're classifying as non-religious there.
Yeah, I just zoomed in the image as well. So yeah, it was things like birthdays, Friendship Day. So they love this also like sort of celebrated these things at school. National Women's Day. They also had Halloween. That created some discussion as to where that should be placed. And Boxing Day and Bonfire Night were the other ones.
Supplementary to that question, it relates to some of the things we found in our project, especially on the quantitative side, and that is whether you just interviewed the non-religious kids, right? And so only the non-religious kids participated in this project.
That's correct. We only sampled children who would have said no or not sure to "Do you believe in God?"
And so were the ceremonies and things that they put on the religious side things that they did, or they just knew about?
It would just be ones that they knew about, but this activity would have been a whole class activity. So it would have been children who did and did not participate in the study, if that makes sense. Okay, so that was the entire class, and maybe in that class I probably worked with about 10 of those children. So yeah, generally it was festivals that everybody knew about.
The reason I mention that is because one of the more interesting findings we're getting out of our project on this, and also on the other project that I'm involved in, that Laurie's leading, that this is in the background here, and that is that the non-religious people or the religious people share most of the stuff with the non-religious people. Then the things that the positive content of the non-religious. That's also positive content for most of the religious. So, for instance, like birthdays, I don't know, Guy Fawkes Day, I don't know, whatever it is, right? that the religious people will do that too. And similarly with the values of equality, inclusion, all these kinds of things. Most religious people will share that in somewhat different proportions, but that there's relatively a minor difference between religious and non-religious people, except perhaps at the extremes. And so I think that makes it become, and part of the motivation for my questioning is it makes it difficult to get at this positive content question, because you have difficulty finding positive content that actually distinguishes the non-religious people strongly and clearly from the religious people. And then that's then the question of the socialization too. We know that that not both religious and non-religious people are highly successful in passing on, a whole core set of values from one generation to the other. And whether they're, in the religious cases, it's often religious values, but in across the board, it's these kind of almost core liberal values that seem to be so dominant in societies like England and in my case Canada.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and just it got me thinking now. What's particularly obviously sort of maybe unique and special about thinking about children in this respect is that for the non-religious, because of sort of RE in schools and things like that, the children will have learned, and they also celebrate the religious festivals in school. So the children will have done the holy day, back then, and Diwali and things like that. So all the non-religious children will have kind of seen that as a festival that, all right, they might not participate in at home with their parents, but they all spoke about something that they've done in school in relation to that festival and holiday. And that's really interesting, thinking about sort of, in terms of what makes it sort of special and unique for the non-religious children,
It makes it difficult. It makes it that much more difficult to get past the question of what non-religious people don't have, to what they do have, right? Because then you get into this question: you want something that they have that the other people don't, and that is comparatively, at least in the research that I've been involved in lately, is it's not so straightforward to find this.
No, I think that's really helpful and something to kind of think through as we're writing. And I just add, I'm leading a kind of a new project that looks at religious as well as non-religious peoples and examines how schools in the UK are promoting ideas of citizenship and national identity and how that relates to religion. And in the kind of first field site where we've been doing field work for that, it's a very different kind of context, and it's majority religiously identifying peoples, although it's a non-religious school, it's a community school. And in that context, definitely, so it includes a minority of non-religious peoples, majority of religious peoples, and definitely the same kind of core emphasis on sort of respect comes through very, very strongly in that context as well. So it's definitely kind of shared in that context as well.
I think we have time for one last question. You can go ahead, Ryan.
Unless somebody else has one, because I already asked one. I didn't want to. Okay. Okay, so another two-parter, and I'll try and be concise here. In some of my conversations with Isabella Castle-Strand, she's made the argument, and I don't mean to frame this as though it's a competition, but she's made the argument that the most secular people are the ones who never think about religion. And I think Quack and Shu would probably would categorize them as the indifferent. And I don't know if you agree with that or not. So that's kind of the first part, is do you see that idea of the people who never think about religion versus those who are like, no, I'm an atheist and my atheism is important to me. So that's kind of the first part. And then the second part is, did you run into any kids who were like this, who just religion? And it's almost there in the paper, because you talk a lot about how a lot of these kids never talk about it, or their parents never talk about it. It just doesn't come up a lot at home. But then they do get some of this with the religion education classes at school. So I'm wondering if you have any kids who are actually, religion just doesn't, I never think about it. It doesn't matter to me. It's completely unimportant to me. I just don't care. And I'm wondering, that's the question. So.
Because of the place of religious education in school, they can't never think about religion.
They have to.
So we definitely get kids like Rachel in the chapter you're writing at the moment. There's a kid called Lewis, for example. He says he doesn't care whether he believes in God or not. He says that. He said it wouldn't matter to him if someone said he had to believe in God. He just wouldn't care. It doesn't matter. So it's very much kind of something that is not an issue of salience for him, because it's not something that's part of his home life. But he still has to engage with that question a bit because of school. So that's kind of close to the kind of person that Isabella is talking about, but they can't avoid thinking about it because it's part of the compulsory curriculum in England. I don't know, Rachel, if you want to add something.
I was going to say, it's kind of like sort of hit the nail on the head of something I found, like, when writing this chapter, quite difficult to sort of articulate when trying to put it together, in the sense that for some children, yes, religion is of minimal importance in their day-to-day life, but it's not that salient, but it's not that they're indifferent about it, and they will have lots of thoughts and opinions about, especially in relation to sort of equality and inclusion. But it's this interesting place that religion does take within the lives of our children, in the sense that it's not that salient in terms of the formation of their own identity as being non-religious, but it doesn't mean that I would say that no, they're not indifferent to it, yeah. So it's a difficult one. I found this sort of dealing with the category of indifference somewhat tricky. But I wouldn't say any of our children really spoke to that indifference category, would you say, Anna?
Yeah, we were talking about this, Rachel and I, kind of recently, are they indifferent or not? Like, there's a really interesting edited collection on religious indifference. We felt that indifference doesn't capture what they're saying about religion. It's something that doesn't have salience for a lot of them, but they have quite clear views. Sometimes they don't know things, but they have positions in relation to religion because they sort of have to take those because of what they encounter in school, in a sense.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there is any other question or comment. Then we can finish this presentation. I want to really thank Anna. Sorry, here there is a question of Eric in the comments. Could the cost of living play a factor in the loss of religious values?
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think our data speaks to that because it was collected slightly earlier than that. But I would say that I think Ingrid Storm, who's at the University of Birmingham with Rachel, is doing a project on exactly that question of the kind of link between economic insecurity and religion. So her data might speak to that more than ours would.
Yeah, I'm sure she has an article out that looked specifically at that, and she used the World Values Survey and data from that in terms of the growth of economic, the economic growth within households and whether the decline or increase in religious activity. But yeah, so that's another thing that we. Sorry, I'm just reading the other comment now. Yeah, again, it wasn't really something that our project actually looked at, but I think it would, particularly at the minute, it would certainly be a really important question to address, and very timely at the minute.
Okay, I want to thank again Anna and Rachel. That was a really interesting presentation, and I'm very glad that we can have this discussion here. So thanks to everyone that asked questions. I think Nathan has a message before we finish, so I will leave you to it, Nathan.
Yes, thanks, Guada. Well, I should say, to people who don't know me, my name is Nathan Alexander. I'm the research coordinator for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. I just included in the chat the registration for the next event of the Meet the Author series, which is happening in 2 weeks, October 18th. at 12 p.m. Eastern time. So in that one, we're going to be hearing from Crystal Manning from Sacred Heart University. And she's going to be talking about her chapter, Meaning-Making Narratives Among Non-Religious Individuals Facing the End of Life. So we've heard about non-religion in childhood today, and now, or then in 2 weeks, we're going to be hearing about non-religion at the end of life. So I think it's almost kind of poetic, I would say. So I just wanted to thank again Anna and Rachel for a really fascinating talk, and everyone for the discussion afterwards, which was great. And hope to see everyone in 2 weeks' time for the next event.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna, Rachel, and everyone. And I hope to see you all in the next event.
Well, thanks for all of your really great questions, really helpful for us.
Okay, bye everyone.